Oh my goodness. Chiefs won. Hey. Sorry to all you Houston fans out there, but we got a three-peat to do, So anyway, all right. Well, we're in a series called Out of Egypt, and we're kind of looking how both Matthew's gospel presents both Jesus and Moses as liberators, as people who lead us into the path of wholeness and freedom and liberation, freedom from oppression of all sorts. And so we've been going through this parallel with Moses and Jesus and Moses, and looking at the Exodus experience and Jesus's leadership and how they parallel each other. Now, we're going to be talking about the addiction of false gods today. So just to see if I've got the right audience with me. Has anybody ever wrestled with an addiction of any sort? Food? Smoking? Wine and drink? Substances? How about shopping? Any ardent shoppers? How about gaming? Or how about that little phone in your pocket? Any ever go down a rabbit hole on TikTok? Did you try to tune into TikTok this morning? There's a message. Kids are spending more time on their phones than in school these days. And if you study the brain chemistry behind the endorphins that are released when you're chasing social media down the rabbit holes, it's as addictive as any other behavioral addiction that can become. Many of you know that I wrestled pretty deeply with some dark addictions. In my mid-50s, I was an insomniac. I functioned pretty well on 3 or 4 hours of sleep for about 26 or 7 years, but kind of caught up to me. I went to a psychiatrist, which I thought was a safe place to go to figure out my sleep problem. He tried me on a bunch of different sleep meds, and the thing that worked like magic was Xanax. I thought I had found a magic pill, and I slept great for about 9 months, and then it wore off dramatically. He upped the dose, and then I thought, I love that sleep that I got on the first few months of Xanax, so I thought, I'll do a couple of shots of vodka with it. And I started doing Xanax and vodka, and I didn't do my own homework. Later, when I was in rehab, I found out that the Xanax alcohol addiction is about as powerful as heroin. And when I was, coming off of that, oh my God, I felt like, now I can relate to heroin addicts. And the addiction of that really cost me. Like I lost. Now, how many of you know that there's a lot of sugar in alcohol? And so I was chasing that sleep at night with the Xanax and the alcohol, right? So now I'm over 5 years sober, right? Hey, right? But now guess what my addiction is? Sugar. And it's not like I didn't have a problem with that before, right? Because I think maybe since I was a kid, I've probably eaten ice cream most every night of my life before I go to bed. And so now I will determine in my heart that I'm not going to do any sugar at night. And I'll go lay in my bed, and then the God of Bluebell calls my name. Fred, you will have all your problems solved in cookies and cream. I will make you feel so good, so awesome. You will fly like an eagle if you just dive in to a half gallon of cookies and cream. And of course, then I say, but I'm only going to have a little bit. Just a little bit. And then I go get it, and then I sit down, and then I eat it. And then the damn thing calls again. Sorry about the D, but anyway. And then it calls again, right? And I'm like, well, heck, if once is good, then another time's got to be good too, right? The more the merrier. But But you know what happens with real addiction? You know, we all struggle with things, but real addiction will take you down and down and down and down and down, and it will isolate you, and it will control you, and it will oppress you. And so there's all kinds of personal oppressions that we can go through. It can be addiction. It can be health issues. You know, I've wrestled with anxiety, depression, different things like that. So even health issues can really be physical pain. Oh my gosh, chronic pain can be like an oppressive force in our life. So there can be personal oppression that we wrestle with. But then there's also systemic oppression. There's systems of oppression. If you go through human history, I mean, you can almost study human history through the stories of dictators. And in the Exodus story, who was the dictator that we talk about? The oppressor. Herron, sorry. Close. That's the Jesus story. Pharaoh is the Exodus story, and then Herod is the Jesus oppressor, right? Who was under the emperor, who was the great oppressor. In our day, if you just say Hitler, then you think oppressor almost immediately, right? But I'm curious, maybe you haven't been under the systemic oppression of a dictator, but how many of you have ever felt oppressed by a, quote, dictatorial type person? Maybe a boss, maybe a school teacher, maybe a significant other, maybe, I mean, it could be an alcoholic father or mother or family member, something like that, right? I had a first grade teacher, Mrs. Matson. And me and my best friend, Michael Jackson, who was a white dude that lived across the street from me. In fact, he visited here last year or 2 years ago, something like that. And anyway, me and Michael were a little bit ornery, and we'd get in a little bit of trouble. She would beat us with rulers. You know, those old wooden rulers? She would twist our ears, and she would stick us in the corner with dunce caps and make our put our noses in the corner. In the first grade, if I'd known about Hitler, I would have called her Mrs. Hitler. I mean, she was my great oppressor. I'm shocked that I love to learn because of that first grade experience. I hated school, right? So there's a lot of different types of oppression, and systemic oppression with Martin Luther King Jr. Day tomorrow. I want us to kind of think about that too, because America has not been devoid of oppression, of systemic oppression, right? Nor has any country on the planet throughout history, by the way. Probably most families even have some oppressors in the family as well, right? Who have that kind of dictatorial, oppressive personality. And so we're going to look in this a little bit. The first thing that I want us to think about is the Exodus story. We've been talking about Moses going to the Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go." And of course, the Pharaoh says no. Moses says, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh says no. And then what happens is the heat turns up, right? It's like, so all of a sudden, we have the 10 plagues. And I'm just going to focus on the first 9 and mention those today. Next weekend, we're going to focus on the Passover, which would have been the 10th, right? But this first part, I just want to look at those first 9 plagues that hit Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay, so Pharaoh's the great oppressor. He has oppressed the Hebrew people. They've been working as slaves with no freedoms for hundreds of years in Egypt. Man, slavery. It's a human institution of horrible, evil proportions. It's an institution that has been in existence throughout human history. And most societies have oppressed their fellow neighbors. And the Hebrew people is a story from Africa of oppression, and it's a slave revolt rising up against the Pharaoh, the dictator. And all of a sudden, Moses says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says no. And now all of a sudden, what starts happening, these plagues start coming in. And as the plagues come, Pharaoh what? Hardens his heart against letting the people go. And so the plagues kind of start out on a low level, and they kind of start ratcheting up and ratcheting up and ratcheting up. As you read the plagues, I want to suggest to you that even the most conservative scholars out there, Jewish or Christian, would not encourage you to read this story literally. Certainly, there's the Exodus experience, but as this story is being told, one of my favorite Jewish scholars calls this story sort of an imperial, pagan imperial, what's his word here? This is Robert Alter saying that this is mostly like a monotheistic satire against an imperial empire. A monotheistic satire against the polytheism of a dictator like Pharaoh. So metaphorically, what we're seeing is the emperor or the Pharaoh resisting letting people go free, resisting equality, resisting the freedom of people to be before God as one, equal before God and all. And this Pharaoh wants to oppress people for his own ego, for his own satisfaction. And so we see these plagues ramping up. The first one is about the water. If you look at the water god of the Nile, Hepe, I think is his name. Happy, I think they call it. But it was the water turning to blood, right? The very first plague. Now, here's what's happening. As you go through those 9 plagues, if you echo back to Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2, where does the Spirit start? Hovering over the waters of the deep. And then God speaks and says, "Let there be light." So the plagues here in Egypt, what started? Is the Spirit hovering over the waters? Well, the waters that are supposed to produce life and goodness, and if you read Genesis 1 and 2, the Spirit hovers over the water, then God says, "Let there be light," and then all of this good stuff starts pouring out. All of these different kinds of animals start pouring out, and then people, humans start pouring out, and it's good, 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 good. And it goes from the waters to the light, to the teeming of every kind of animals, to humanity, and all of it's good, and all of it's in the image of God. Wow, beautiful. But this story starts out, and the waters turn to blood, and life cannot live. This group of plagues is creation backwards. It's decreation. It starts with the waters turning to blood that cannot produce life. And what's the 9th plague? Darkness. Darkness. So instead of starting with the Spirit over the waters and then everything's good coming out of this, let there be light, this one starts out with the waters turning to blood, and then all of creation devolves and becomes horrible. I mean, frogs become nasty, locusts become nasty, flies become nasty. Every single living thing that is in Genesis 1 and 2 that's good is horribly negative in the first 9 plagues of this. And there's a polemic against the polytheistic. Every one of these plagues would have an Egyptian god. The god of the Nile, the waters, the god of the frogs, Heket, the god of mosquitoes, Khepri, the god of the flies, Khepri, another one, the god of the livestock, Apis, Ptah, Hathor, the god of the boils, Hekhmet, the god of hail, Seth, the god of locusts, Senhem, and then the darkness, which would be Amun-Re. These are all of the polytheistic gods of Egypt, and every one of these plagues is like a monotheistic satire against the polytheism and the devolution, the decreation of all that's good. And that's what happens with oppression. So oppression takes what's good. Addiction takes what's good. Food's a great gift, right? Wine's a great gift. I mean, the phones can be a great gift. Gaming can be a great gift. There's nothing in creation that can't be used for good and beauty because God made it that way. But there's almost nothing in creation that can't be used in a negative way to become enslaving and oppress us, either personally or systemically. And so we're looking at even systemic oppression, and particularly as we're on the eve of Martin Luther King, I'm thinking about systemic oppression in America. You know, all men are created equal. I mean, what a profound, great idea that we established in America, right? Beautiful. And it was the first attempt to massive democracy in the world. But there was a little bit of blindness, wasn't there, in the early founding fathers? Our original sin was that we would have to qualify it, all white men, all European white men are created equal. In America, 1776, all men are created equal. But 100 years later, guess what? Blacks are still enslaved in America. When was the first time, legally, by law, that blacks were emancipated from slavery? What year? 1865, okay? 1865, 13th Amendment. What year did blacks who were thought in the Constitution, in the amendment, it was stated that blacks were 3/5 of a human being. When did that end? That ended in 1968, 3 years after slaves were emancipated in 1965. When could women vote? Not until 1920. 1920. My grandmother was born, I think, in like 1899, and women weren't allowed to vote till 1920. She was 21 years old when she had the right to vote. When were indigenous Americans allowed to vote and considered U.S. citizens? That was 1924. But when slaves were emancipated and black people were counted as a full human, what then went into place in the South in particular? What we call Jim Crow laws, legal segregation. And when did legal segregation end? Not until 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And then the denomination that I grew up in, Southern Baptist, guess what? They read the Bible in such a way that they thought the Bible taught that blacks should be slaves. And they taught that in the pulpits in the South. Do you know how long it took for the Southern Baptists to apologize? 1996. Isn't that bizarre? Isn't that bizarre? So we can easily have blindness about systemic oppression, and we don't want to assume that the playing field is all even now that we've had a black president, right? Do you know to this day that if you're a black man and you have certain drug content that you're carrying on your being, possession of drugs, you can do 20 years in prison for possession of drugs. Do you know that a rich white man can have the same exact amount of drug in their possession? And if they have a rich warrior, they not only do no jail time or prison time, but they get off with community service. So the distribution of justice and the distribution of misery is still not equal in this country. We have a lot of battles still to fight, but we've come so far, but we've still got further to go. I did an interview this week, or actually a few weeks ago, right before Christmas, with Adam Clark, who teaches black theology at Xavier University. I'd highly recommend him. He did his PhD work with James Cone, who was the originator, founder of black theology in America. James Cone studied with Martin Luther King Jr. and with Malcolm X, and then started writing about black theology. And I don't think you can understand the actual gospel that Jesus taught unless you understand it through the eyes of the oppressed. Jesus was an oppressed Palestinian under the Roman Empire. The blacks were an oppressed people here in America. And the theology that black theology forged was seeing the gospel of Jesus as it was intended by Jesus through the eyes of the oppressed. I did a podcast interview, released this just a couple of days ago, and I want to show you just a clip from this interview. Adam Clark, professor of black theology at Xavier University, and a friend of mine. Let's roll that clip real quick.
Probably the best way to understand black and all liberation theology is to read Exodus, right? Because the paradigm of that is the Exodus story, right? When the Hebrews were called to be free from Pharaoh, right? It wasn't just about changing your soul, right? It was a material liberation, right? And that's where all liberation theology movement, they reread Exodus, that Exodus isn't a historical event. Exodus is an ongoing event.
Yeah.
That we are the people of Exodus. And Exodus is probably the most important passage in Black Christian history, right? Because you have an enslaved people who lead a slave rebellion against a tyrannical dictator.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Black people read that with a sign of hope, right? To say if God did that for the Hebrew people, God could do that for our people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about Pharaonic Empire, we're talking about American Empire,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a rereading of the biblical narrative in the "Let My People Go" tradition within the United States, and that's what keeps Black people Christian, and that's what Black theology is about.
Yeah.
It's like how God moves within the Exodus paradigm.
Mm. Man, you know, one of my Black pastor friends here in Kansas City made a comment to that. He says, you know, what if the people, the Jewish people, had to stay in Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
Story instead of leaving Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure.
You know, think about the difference between leaving Egypt and moving to a new promised land.
To their promising,
having to stay in Egypt and try to live this freedom out among masters. You know?
Well, what does it mean to sing a new song in a strange land? I mean, part of these are just metaphorical ideas about that. I mean, even like two things. One thing that people should remember is that when Barack Obama wrote his biography about his years in office, he titled it The Promised Land, right? In terms of that, right? So he's like playing on that metaphor too, right? In terms of that. So that's just really talking about just how important that imagery has been in the context of American history, or Black American history, I should say. So and also I should say Jesus becomes a second Jesus, the Lukean Jesus, the Jesus of Luke 4:19, where Jesus comes to the synagogue, right, and opens the scroll of Isaiah, and it connects his anointing to what? Setting the captives free, right, giving sight to the blind, and letting the oppressed go free, right, and that type of thing.
Jubilee.
Right. And declaring the year of Jubilee, right? Yeah. So a Jubilee is a way of trying to talk about freedom, right? Of debt, freedom of enslavement, right? All of this becomes like very important in the context of the African American tradition. So that becomes the mission of Jesus. So the Spirit is connected to these practical works, and that's the mission of Jesus. So both the Exodus narrative and also the authoritative meaning of Jesus in Luke become combined to understand how Black people are rereading this Christian tradition in light of the spirit of liberation that was happening at the time.
Yeah, so my Black pastor friend was like, think about if the people of the Hebrew people in Egypt, said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and then they had to live out that freedom in Egypt under the Pharaoh. Which in America, when Martin Luther King, when the Black movement said, "Let my people go," they had to live in the America that had done the oppression. Yeah, so think about that. That's a huge, huge thing. So we wrestle with personal oppression, right? But we also still wrestle with systemic oppression. And we've talked many times here about the marginalized in our culture, even the LGBTQ plus community in our culture. These things, we have to, as Jesus followers, advocate for freedom of all types, both personally and systemically for all people everywhere. It's one of our callings. Jesus picked up on this even in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:24, and Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters. You'll hate the one, love the other, love the one, hate the other. You cannot serve, and then he named one, right? You cannot serve God and money. Power, money, oppression, these things go together. Rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And so Jesus himself is saying, hey, I'm like Moses. I'm leading freedom. You cannot serve the power of oppression and the power of love at the same time. They don't work together. Love liberates. Love frees. Love consoles and comforts and has empathy. Love is the way that we need to live. I want to play a song for you as the song of reflection, okay? And this is a cover of Bob Dylan's song, Gotta Serve Somebody. Gotta serve somebody. This is really, I think, what the Exodus story and Jesus are talking about. What are you going to serve? Are you going to serve love, or are you going to serve some other corruption of a false god, right? And so I tried to find a really good Bob Dylan version of his own song, and I couldn't find it on YouTube, right? So I found a cover of it that's actually really good. The cover of this is done by Eric Burden, and there might be somebody old enough in here that knows the Animals. Bill knew them. You remember House of the Rising Sun? Eric Burden was the guy, singer, wrote this. Right? And he's a crazy dude. If you know the Beatles, I Am the Walrus, and they talk about the Eggman and Yellow-Bellied Custard, that story was about Eric Burden. But I can't tell it in church, all right? So, anyway. But this is Eric Burden covering Gotta Serve Somebody, which I think is really at the crux of this whole Exodus Jesus story about let my people go. Let's roll that.
Might be an ambassador to England or France. You might like to gamble, you might like to dance. You might be the heavyweight champion of the world. Could be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You might be a rock and roller prancing on the stage. Might have money and drugs, women in a cage. You may be a villain man or some Wall Street thief. They may call you doctor, or they may call you chief, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You could be a state trooper, you might be a young Turk, you might be the head of some big TV network. You may be rich or poor, maybe blind or lame. Could be living in another country under an assumed name, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You might be a construction worker, working on a home, maybe living in a mansion, maybe living in a dome. You may even own guns, you may even own tanks. Might be somebody landlord, may even own a bank, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You may be a preacher with your own spiritual pride. You may be a city councilman taking bribes on the side. You may be working in a barber shop. You maybe even know how to cut hair. Maybe somebody's mistress. Maybe somebody's au pair. But you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil. It might be the Lord. But you gotta serve somebody. Might like to wear cotton, might like to wear silk, might like to drink whiskey, might even like milk, may even like caviar. Soak it up with your bread, maybe sleeping on the floor or sleeping in a king-size bed. But you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. You gotta serve somebody. Yeah. Serve somebody. It might be the devil. Might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. You gotta lay your body and your soul down, way down to the ground. But you gotta be in the service of somebody. You gotta serve somebody. Gotta serve somebody. Yeah. Well, it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. Ow.
You know, Dylan's birth name was Zimmerman. His grandparents are Jewish. And then he had a period in his life where he actually attended a friend of mine's church in L.A., and gave his life to Jesus and came out with an album called Slow Train Runnin'. It was a double album. It was his only Christian album that he did, and that song, Gotta Serve Somebody, was on his Slow Train Runnin' Christian album. So, yeah, we're going to move into communion.